This is an exhaustive 600-page memoir about depression from an author who is endowed with the ability to write in a manner that can aesthetically and truly, I think, represent depression. But this also means that the specific book, was very, very triggering for me. And I found that I had to put it down a couple of times. Although a bit dated, it was published in 2001 with an added chapter in 2015. The Noonday Demon, an atlas of depression, came very close to me experiencing what it must actually be like for those of my clients suffering from a deep depression. The book should come with a trigger warning, and it's certainly not for everyone. It took me 2 months to read this book, and I gave the book 4 out of 5 stars. I'd certainly not recommend it to those of my clients who are in the throes of an episode of depression or, like me, extremely anxious overthinkers, unless you have your coping mechanisms and grounding exercises in place. I admit that I suffered a panic attack that woke me up from deep sleep. And while I cannot say this caused it, I can say that my thoughts during my attack were mostly the contents of this book, which didn't help because I started sinking into a bit of a mood once I regained a little bit of control. Having said that, if you are a student of psychology or a caregiver for someone with mental health issues, please read this book. Dr. Solomon, while he's not a therapist himself, teaches at Columbia University's Medical Center, Yale School of Medicine, and has written extensively for the New York Times, the New Yorker, NPR, and other publications. In fact, it was a 1998 article on depression that he had written for the New Yorker, which received an overwhelming number of responses that prompted him to research and write this book. He lives with his husband and son in New York and is an activist in LGBTQ rights as well. One other important consideration is that I came into this book with the full knowledge that Dr. Solomon lives a privileged life and is the son of a pharmaceutical mogul. But this is also why I was able to see how society might expect him, someone who has everything monetarily, professionally, a great support system, someone entitled, to not suffer from depression, and how people can be judgmental and can look at such a person as self-indulgent simply because he talks authentically about his own depression. So I was fully aware of that. I always read books from an author's perspective, that author's perspective. We don't do this with academic peer-reviewed work, of course, but this one talks beautifully about what it is like to be all of this and to suffer. He goes on to talk about his breakdowns, his treatments, his opinions on alternative therapies, etc., etc. So while I won't go so far as to say that this is an atlas of depression, I do think that this 2001 book with, like I said, a 2015 addendum offers volumes of information, a lot of which has been updated over the last 2 decades. I don't usually quote excerpts from books, but this time I must make an exception. In one part of his book, he speaks about his love-hate relationship with medication and therapy. He calls his breakdowns and his recovery a box step, this slowly getting better, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I thought that was amazing. He also quotes Sylvia Plath, and when she was depressed, she felt as if her head had been encaged in lucite, like a butterfly trapped forever in the thick transparency of a paperweight. And that gives me a very visual image of what it must be like to be depressed. Another hard-hitting statement about why the author did not actively attempt suicide was him saying that his vanity and sense of obligation saved him, meaning depression lowered his self-esteem, but it did not eliminate pride. I think that was beautiful. He touches on how so many therapists and psychiatrists very insensitively talk down to their clients and patients as if They were retarded in addition to being depressed. So these are the words that he uses. His book also touches on the dilemma of medication, length of medication, going off medication, getting back on medication, frustrations with finding the right psychiatrist, the right therapists, trying to convince therapists or doctors that some medications are really not working and that you're not lying about it. And then collaborating with your doctors rather than them rubbishing your claims as nonsense. I think these are very important topics. He writes about shopping around for good therapists and psychiatrists and rehearsing and repeating his issues every single time, and how it eventually feels like reciting a monologue from someone else's play. Any therapy is only as good as a therapist, more than the choice of therapeutic system. So, this is all him. He speaks about the dilemma of it being really hard to be honest with a long term therapist because you also don't want to disappoint or to let that therapist down. I can go on, and I just feel, and I mean, this is what this indicates. I have so many of these marks, bookmarks here. The reason why I did not give the book 5 stars is because I don't think it's really an atlas. An atlas to me is more like an encyclopedia, data driven without personal opinions or commentary or bias. This book to me was a very first person perspective, interspaced with data. But I would think it is not really neutral and neither recent, but it's certainly relevant, of course. There were parts of the narrative that I did not agree with, but I understand that the author was being authentic at the cost of his own reputation, which I value very much. I also do think, since I'm reviewing the book as an Indian psychologist, culturally it was not really representative, although there are chapters dedicated to population, politics, history, and the evolution of depression. Of course, I understand that one cannot cover everything for a popular audience. That's more for an academic audience. Overall, however, I applaud the author for allowing himself to be so vulnerable and sharing with us his experience in, like I said before, the most visually appealing, tasteful, despite being very dark and sometimes starless manner. It was both a piece of prose and poetry to me. It made me sad and hopeful at the same time. It made me laugh and cry. Uh, it was a heavy book that in many parts was unsettling, but so very insightful that I would read it again. Especially insightful for a therapist like me who works with clients who live with depression. There's a link to the book below, which, if you use at no extra cost to you, I get credit to buy more books to review. Until next time, happy trails to you.